Is this thing on yet?
I've been couching my terms regarding the supposed falsity of flattish eartherism. This deserves a real sense of reason as to why I am doing so. The reason is derivable from the aforementioned unicorn cultures. The reality, that is, the existential validity of something has at least of itself the epistemic reality of something, and its ontological reality sans any epistemic. To hold that flattish eartherism is false is to hold that it doesn't obtain ontological validity. However, that it doesn't hold ontological validity doesn't entail that it also doesn't hold epistemic validity, or more generally speaking, epistemic existence. Flattish eartherism exists, in other words, as an epistemic reality. Thoughts, ideas, spirits, souls, these things exist in the sense of epistemic reality. Perhaps better phrased, the epistemic ontology. The manner and ways by which such epistemic entities interact with the ontology sans any epistemic varies. In the neoclassical formulations of truth or truth, the notion is to weed out those epistemic entities that do not conform to the ontological reality sans any epistemic. Such is broadly understood as the scientific disposition, and its accompanying philosophical dispositions. Perhaps more pointedly, to weed out the epistemically ontologically relevant from the ontologically relevant entities that obtain their ontological validity sans any reference to the epistemic. In essence, to conform the epistemic ontology to that of the ontology sans any epistemic reality whatsoever. To hold that flattish eartherism is factually wrong is not to say that it doesn't exist or that it lacks any ontology whatsoever. Rather, it is to say that the manner by which flattish earthers are understanding the world doesn't conform to the understanding of the world sans any epistemic ontology. More broadly, the concern is that the manner by which the epistemically valid ontology interacts with the ontology sans any epistemic considerations whatsoever varies predicated upon the epistemic ontology. To think that the earth is flattish is to interact with the world as if it were flattish. Such has, in other words, a lot of pragmatism to it, as is evident by the fact that the human species pretty much always interacts with the world as if it were flattish. Indeed, it's plausibly the case that most if not all life on Earth also interacts with the world and understands the world as if it were not roundish. Truth, and indeed truth, are functional kinds of relations that regulate how the species interacts with the world. People act as if Santa Claus were real, and thereby create a reality in which Santa Claus is real. The specifics of that reality matter, but the point is that it has actual ontological import. People do things, do actions, give meaning, through the epistemic ontology of Santa Claus. People decorate, celebrate, give gifts, host family gatherings, and so forth. It has cultural import which thereby creates an actual ontology. To hold that it doesn't is to hold that Christmas isn't real, as if the actual actions of people themselves doing the things somehow doesn't exist. It is to literally and figuratively point out something, and then claim that the thing one is actually pointing to doesn't exist. When we suppose that flattish eartherism is false, we are not therefore denying its ontology, rather, we are making a choice as to how the species' epistemic ontology is interacting with the ontology sans any epistemic whatsoever. As previously alluded to, that choice being the choice to hold that the epistemic ontology ought to conform to the ontology sans any epistemic considerations whatsoever. Again, it is important for the reader to get a real sense of the kinds of things that are at stake when we are speaking of colonialism, privileging of a given position, and TPKing flattish earthers. The point of such dispositions being a kind of choice will be returned to later in this piece. Here note the rather striking point that choice is classically and neoclassically caught up in the questions of ethical concerns. In the Poetics. And so it is. Just like you said it would be. Life goes easy on me. Most of the time. And so it is. The shorter story. No love, no glory. No hero in her sky. By this kind of understanding, we may hold that flattish eartherism is factually incorrect, where that is understood as an epistemically ontic aspect that doesn't conform to the ontic sans any epistemic whatsoever, and yet it may not actually be false, as falsity doesn't hold to the same kind of concerns as factual correctness/incorrectness. Falsity, again, and truth for that matter, having more going on with it. Rather specifically, such concepts focus more upon the epistemically ontic as such, and the various ways by which such can interface with the ontic sans the epistemic at all, rather than the rather flat view that it ought to conform to the ontic sans the epistemic. I want to also relate this to the earlier points regarding moral praiseworthiness and moral blameworthiness. Specifically, the suggestion that such blame/praise relates rather well to the categorical distinctions between the aesthetically ethically relevant and the ethically relevant sans any aesthetic consideration whatsoever. As the wording there already suggests, I want to hold that the ethically relevant sans any aesthetical consideration whatsoever relates strongly to the ontologically relevant sans any epistemic consideration whatsoever. When we refer to, in other words, such things as the ontic sans any reference to the epistemic, in ethical terms we are referring to ethical aspects that obtain independent of any aesthetical considerations. Those are the sorts of ethical concerns that have an obligatory aspect to them. Think such things as, for instance, murder, plausibly some other ethical concerns, but this piece isn't attempting to give an exhaustive list of these, rather, we are trying to provide the proper ethical framework for understanding the world. Juxtaposed to that are the aesthetically ethical concerns. These have a variety of modalities of interfacing with the ontological, and indeed, with the ethical, sans any consideration of the epistemic or aesthetical respectively. The modes of dress, styles, dietary concerns, etc., these kinds of aspects of life that are caught up far more in the epistemic ontic and which are not necessarily beholden to the ontic sans the epistemic, carry no obligatoriness to their ethicities, but nonetheless do carry ethicities to them. In other words, it is ethically praiseworthy or blameworthy to dress nicely, or to dance and sing well, to think well, to be sexual in this or that way and to do it well or not, to artistically express oneself well. But in none of these cases are such things ethically obligatory to do, nor does the failure to do these things entail an obligation of avoidance. In the case of the flattish earthers, we are here perhaps pushing against these kinds of boundaries, the question that is, if there is any worthwhile ethicity to the mereness of being factually wrong, or for being factually correct about something. Moreover, there is a rather striking claim heretofore being mostly tacitly held that deserves some explicitness in its statement. There are a wide variety of modes of interfacing with the ontic sans the epistemic, far and away more than the mereness of conforming the epistemic to the ontic sans the epistemic. These all have ethical validity to them provided they are not violating the obligatory ethical concerns, their ethicity, resting in, nesting in, building in, playfully playing within the aesthetically praise and blameworthy aspects of the epistemic and the why and hows whereby the epistemic interfaces with the ontic sans the epistemic. To hold to the disposition that this or that aesthetic aspect in praiseworthy or blameworthy is to actively create within the world through the actions that accrue thereof. Note that in each of these cases, praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, the ethical concerns are far and away lesser than those that accrue from obligatory sorts of ethical actions. It may be praiseworthy, in other words, but there isn't a real obligation involved to perform the sort of actions involved. It may be blameworthy, but there isn't a real obligation to not perform the sort of actions involved. In either case, part of their ethicity is stemming rather directly from their capacity to thereby creatively structure the reality. In either case there is a kind of imperative involved, such as what also grants its praise and blameworthiness, but in neither case is the imperative such as to delineate well between, say, good and evil. There is a sense, a very good sense, that those kinds of actions simply do not raise to the level of the good and the evil. This kind of modeling fits fairly well with notions of objective and subjective considerations, and works well within, I suspect, a variety of intuitions on the matter, e.g. there are some things that are noted as being good and being evil, but which clearly are not, and yet which also clearly have something to them. Some actions are of serious ethical concerns, others are not, yet they may all partake in ethicity. There may be objective morals and objective ethics, yet there are clearly a wide variety of ethical dispositions in the ontology. In the matter of ethical concerns regarding the flattish earther, spoiler, the suggestion is going to be that these kinds of factual concerns actually amount to merely moral praiseworthy/blameworthiness, and not to actual concerns of good and evil. However, there remain plausible instances of consideration regarding how these kinds of ethical considerations may alter upon iteration and implementation. These will be expanded upon considerably in this and other pieces. Here note that among the principal delineations amounting to how serious, and with what levities, such aesthetical ethical considerations are given, and so too, with such ethical non-aesthetical considerations. There remain deserved explanations regarding the supposed falsity of flattish eartherism. Let's return to the question of TPKing flattish earthers. Let's suppose the following is true: flattish eartherism causes no harm. There is, therefore, no ethical justification predicated upon harm whereby TPKing flattish eartherism is justifiable. We may hold, for instance, that to do so is kinda like piking someone for thinking that a certain style of clothing is wrong. In the worse, more common of cases, it is akin to holding that they deserve to be piked simply in virtue of the fact that we disagree with them. That the ontological facts of the matter sans any epistemic ontology whatsoever do not apply. To give further analogies, it is similar to holding that a particular kind of dance is wrong, and due to its wrongness it ought not exist, and therefore we determine that it shall not exist. How folks may be imprisoned for a dance, a song, a piece of clothing, or the lacking thereof. Now, there are some fairly simple and straightforward ways of addressing this. If, after all, the flattish earthers want to speak about flattish earthism, they might expect an in-kind response from the people that they are speaking to. If the flattish earthers want to teach, educate, and argue for flattish eartherism, we might expect those they are speaking to give some kind of in-kind response. If folks want to push, peddle, or attempt to alter another's epistemic understanding, they ought very well expect those they are pushing, peddling, and attempting to alter to do so in kind. Such amounts to, in effect, the defensive justification for piking someone. There is plausibly a kind of ethical justification involved therein. However, what is plausibly ethically justifiable about it is that it dodges the question entirely. After all, what we've done is suppose that the flattish earthers are doing the very thing that we are holding up in question. Is there even an ethical justification for flattish earthers to try attempting to PK the roundish earthers in the first place? Such is a kind of philosophical jujitsu that holds something like, look, do what you want, I'll do what I want, think what you want, I'll think what I want, but once you attack, I'm going to TPK your ass. Was there any justification in the first place for the flattish earthers to attack? I mean, that gets into somewhat awkward historical arguments about who started it, which again doesn't really address the pertinent question, is it ever ethically justifiable to PK someone, and is it ever ethically okay to TPK a group? Again, there are plausible instances where such at least seems valid. Introduction of new technology that makes living life better, or introduction of new crops, foods, etc. These are all TPKs on a culture, they are all cultural genocide. But, I think most people are inclined to hold that such is justifiable, good even, though perhaps not an unqualified good. Likewise, if a culture is practicing human sacrifice of some sort, slavery, child murder, etc., most people are going to think something like, yeah, TPK that shit. More controversially, TPKing racism, sexism, bigotry, nationalism, etc., are plausible instances of justifiable TPKs. the justification being that they supposedly cause a wide variety of harms. I say supposedly because, again, there are disagreements regarding the details of these sorts of things. Noting that the controversies therein also carry within them a similar, though somewhat inverted concern. Namely, it may very well be the case that those kinds of unethical aspects are factually true in that they are exactly the sort of things the species does, is, etc., and to TPK them is to TPK exactly some significant aspects of the species itself. I may hold that those kinds of things are little more than aesthetical considerations, and hence are plausibly instances whereby they can and ought to be TPK'd. Though there is a fair amount of pertinence to the points as to how exactly to go about such things in an ethical manner, and to what exactly may constitute a merely aesthetical aspect, and what may constitute a more pertinent ethical concern. Noting that, for instance, skin color is a reality, yet it is an aesthetical consideration as a matter of ethics, and plausible one whereby the determination of ethical considerations predicated upon skin color is a kind of miscategorization of ethicities, e.g. preference of tastes better captures the entire extent of ethical considerations regarding skin colors, rather than anything of non-aesthetical import. However, in the case of flattish earthers, their only crime is being factually wrong in a fairly limited sense by which that term actually means. Where that term doesn't mean has no ontological import, no existential validity to it. Rather, factually wrong entails a highly specific interpretation as to how humans ought to understand and interact with the world. To be clear, that entails a specific sort of ethical imperative, which is the very kind of ethical imperative under consideration here. Wherein things look so bad everywhere, a more gentle disposition may constitute a higher love. I want to convey to the reader the sort of situation, as I see it, historically and in the current, that they might better grasp at the conundrums involved. Battling over factual interpretations is a kind of infighting predicated upon a peculiar way of understanding the world. I take for granted the existential reality, the ontological validity of the epistemic forms. Likewise, I take for granted the ontological validity of the existential sans any epistemic considerations whatsoever. When folks speak of such things as concepts, cultures, ideas, thoughts, souls, etc., I take for granted that these kinds of things exist, that they are ontologically valid. In some most meaningful sense, I don't see how anyone can actually doubt that such is the case. Though note that such traditionally is a very controversial view, in the current times thanks to the internets, this is likely something that may seem obvious to people. After all, the factual claims against the fictive as such entails the following: look at that, existing, thing over there. It isn't real, doesn't exist. Via the internets, note the reality of the wide variety of varying opinions, views, cultures, etc., each of which are clearly really there. At best, such factual claimants may hold that the manner, ways, modalities of such fictive things existing is different, but not that they are non-existent. Such best-case scenarios may hold that the differences are important in some pragmatic manner, and hence that such fictive things that they are pointing to ought not continue, or that the manner in which they continue ought to be revised. At their worst, such factual claimants may hold that fictive things are wrong, but such wrongness implies something far more of an ethical sort of claim being leveled against them, than the factual claim being supposedly made. Hence, these kinds of supposed factual claims cannot resolve themselves predicated upon facts alone. After all, one of the facts of the matter is always the ontological validity of the fictive thing they are supposedly factually discounting, and hence all such claims eventuate in some other modality of concern, specifically some ethical consideration that underpins the factual claim being leveled. Note that there are instances of factual claims that are indeed relevant. There is a famous quip in the philosophy of ontology: ontology can be summed up in one question, what exists, and it can be answered in one word, everything. The punchline, still, we might disagree on individual instances. In other words, the hows, means, and ways whereby such existing things exist. It may be fair to say, for instance, that flattish earthers are factually wrong in the sense that it fails to conform its epistemic ontic to the ontic sans any epistemic, yet such, again, doesn't say a whole lot, least of all does it say that flattish eartherism doesn't exist, and it's fairly fuzzy to make the claim that flattish earth doesn't exist. A dance in a song doesn't conform its epistemic ontic to the ontic sans any epistemic whatsoever, and yet nonetheless the song and the dance are real, existing things, with real import and effective form to them. To hold that because they are not factually correct and that they depend upon a relation between the epistemic ontic and the ontic sans any epistemic whatsoever, doesn't really amount to a whole lot in terms of serious concerns. It does, however, noteworthy, perhaps praiseworthy, perhaps blameworthy, give an indication as to the whys, hows, ways and means of these ontological relevant entities. Folks ought to hear the echoes of a variety of claims and issues in the current discourse surrounding supposed delusional thinking, and a great deal of the discourse on the issues of transness and queerness. In other words, the mixing and matching, misusing and misunderstanding of the ethical moral claimants of wrongness with that of the factual claimants of wrongness, confusions over utilizations of terms like truth, truthiness, falseness, wrongness, factualness, etc. In the common discourse these all essentially refer to the same sorts of things. Right and wrong are stand-ins for factually correct or not, and virtually no one in the current discourse really even seems to consider that the concepts of truth and falseness, etc., may be referring to something other than factual correctness and factual incorrectness. For instance, such may be referred to as opinion. To reference the common parlance on the matter, the idiom, one is entitled to one's opinion but one is not entitled to one's facts supposes this kind of conflation of factualness with truth, truthiness, and truth. More damagingly so, such is conflated with right and wrong, as in one is not entitled to right and wrong, where those are conflated and confused with factually correct and factually incorrect. Worse yet, as is being intimated, explained, and expounded upon in this piece, such as fairly clearly conflating aesthetical ethical concerns, and hence too, epistemically ontic kinds of things, with ethical concerns sans any aesthetic, and hence too, the ontic sans any epistemic whatsoever. It is as if saying that there is something of ethical concern about a style of dress, or a dance being done in some place or another that has ontological import to it sans any epistemic or aesthetical considerations whatsoever. Such concerns, insofar as they are, occur exactly via the interfacing between the epistemic and the ontic, and within the aesthetical is the ontic. In the case of flattish earthers, the ethical consideration is the supposed factual consideration, the ethical imperative that is towards truth rather than fiction, though in some sense even truth carries with it a similar sort of ethical imperative. Let's hammer on that point a bit, the conflation of truth as being in opposition to fiction, and what is typically construed as fiction. Are ideas fiction? Are thoughts fiction? What could that even really mean? They have ontological validity to them. We may ponder at the mechanics of exactly how those thoughts, ideas, etc., have their ontological validity, but to doubt that they exist would run counter to the very notion of their ontological validity. We may suppose, therefore, that the position of truth is not such as a position in opposition to the ontological validity of any given idea, thought, etc., but merely in how those ideas, thoughts, etc., interface with other ontologically valid aspects of life. If pressed by the scientifically minded folks as to what that could mean, how those things might be not fictive, one can always simply reply, well, within the basic scientific framework they literally exist within the brain, perhaps within the mind, as neurons interacting, perhaps as the form of what neurons are interacting. Regardless, there is a thing there that can be pointed to and said to actually be the things these people are doubting. As if those scientifically minded folks, of love, of truth, of the world in these messy times. I'm a mess, I'm a loser. I'm a hater, I'm a user. I'm a mess for your love, it ain't new. I'm obsessed, I'm embarrassed. I don't trust no one around us. I'm a mess for your love, it ain't new. Consider again the flattish earthers. Given the reality the human species faces, its day-to-day experiences of the world, their supposed evolutionary origins of thinking, would we not exactly expect that there would be some set of neurons that actually exist specifically to understand and interpret the world as flattish? After all, it is far more convenient for the species, more practical in their existence, to understand the world as flattish. We may even localize such in theory towards those aspects of the brain, perhaps the mind, that grant the human species a sense of gravity, that interpret the world via up and down, that give a sense of balance to the species' understanding, utilizing the weight of the world as a means of measure and a kind of pragmatic motion of control over the body. We may conjecture such for a variety of reasons, most pertinent among them being that the concept of gravity is all wrapped up in the question of the shape of the earth. We may, in other words, suppose that the brain, perhaps the mind, developed such notions exactly in response to the experience of gravity. In a few sentences, this experientially flattish earth pulls down upon the body, providing that sense of gravity to it. Later, attached to that sense of gravity, those very same neurons constructed a sense of gravity predicated upon a roundishness of the earth. Later still, and still building upon those same sets of neurons, the conceptualization of gravity developed into the species' current understanding of gravity as being curved space-time via the mass of an object. To paraphrase the poets, it's gonna be a long Monday. Whereby such a lyrical motion of thought best be understood, y'all, via the entirety of the song. Its entire import being utilized, perhaps a bit messily so in the summation of the line with all its import. The integration of the poetic with the philosophical being its aim, and such too with the other poetical quotations in this and similar pieces. If I said the musings of the muses, perhaps some would capitulate more to the thought, and perhaps such is of relevant import to the author, but still, regardless, such is the notion being forwarded here. That emotive capture via the musical interlude the quotation provides, being that upon which the emotive disposition of the reader ought refer. Musings, such perhaps being the musical philosophical disposition and not without point, purpose, aim, intention, or ethicity of form in all matters. The point being that the experiential reality of the flattish earther is underpinned by the same set of neurons, the same reality with differing interpretations. Those interpretations being the fairly ephemeral fictive aspects that truth, or even truth, wrestles with. The youth, those youngin neurons, the wee ones, babies and little ones, the forms upon which the later developed forms are themselves predicated on, yet perhaps not reducible to. Consider again such as a matter of fractal form, a self-similarly structured form. To TPK flattish earthers is to TPK the interpretation, but even a TPK of the interpretation is very likely to leave the neurons upon which gravity as a concept exists intact, e.g. the experiential reality that the human species has that initially interprets and tends to shorthand the experience of gravity as flat Earth. The species' sense of up and down relative to the Earth's gravitational pull, in other words, despite it being flatly false, is likely to remain, pun intended. My suspicion is that like the flattish earther, there are similar sorts of endemic modalities of thought to the human species that are predicated upon similar kinds of foundational neurological structures. A kind of limitation of biology that is overcomable via exactly the kinds of fictive forms associated with such things as ideas, unicorns, thoughts, emotions, discourse, etc., but which are not likely entirely eliminable by such methodologies, and which may actually not be desirable to be eliminable, e.g. there is every reason to seriously doubt the efficacy of, say, eliminating the foundational neurons upon which such basic things as sense of gravity are predicated upon. Such touches upon longer-term issues. It may after all be the case that through evolutionary practices, something like flattish eartherism can be eliminated, whereby the neurons upon which the concept is predicated may be adapted, through, for instance, iterations of the human species understanding, teaching, TPKing flattish eartherism. All of such we may take as a privileging of the position of roundish eartherism, steadfastness in holding to that privileging, and iterations of generations of the species. In short, colonialism predicated upon the imaginative fictive form, truth, and similarly truth and truthiness. Still therein remains the ethical conundrum. But there is a step forwards in the question. No longer considering fact or truth as the final arbiter of ontological validity, nor for that matter truth, or even truthiness, recognizing that those two are conceptual forms whose ontological validity is epistemic in form, whose traditional notion of ethicity is either tacitly or explicitly to self-similarly structure the epistemic ontic to that of the ontic sans any epistemic at all, entails understanding its potential ethicity and its potential problems. Such also defines the parameters of the central question regarding the ethicity of TPKing flattish eartherism predicated upon their being factually incorrect. Namely, that such an ethicity is very imaginative in its form, and the imaginative forms are exactly its field of play, perhaps, to paraphrase the poets, the fields of gold. Good or bad ideas do not necessarily relate one-to-one with the ontology sans the epistemic. Arguably they cannot do so, at least, insofar as there is any distinction at all to be made between the ontological epistemic and the ontic sans any epistemic at all. Arguably there is something ethically odd about such practices in general, which can in some sense be summed up by noting the ethical dubiousness of colonialism, of privileging some specific modality of epistemic/ontic interfacing over others, especially as they relate to the notion of factuality. Truth, in other words, isn't summarizable as fact or ontology, nor for that matter is the good. Truth has of itself a freedom of form and association with it, rather strongly so. The questions of which direction to go is fundamentally predicated upon the factualness of choice, of freedom thereof to do so. The factualness of the matter, the ontological structure of the matter, entails merely a given state, within and through which the actions of choice and deliberation and actualization actually matter. That is, they have import, in an important sense in the same way that unicorn culture or Santa Claus cultural dispositions have choice inherent to them. Their reality is literally and figuratively predicated upon the truth-functional relation between the epistemically ontologically valid and the ontic sans any epistemic at all. To directly quote the poets, in all meaningfully applicable ways, nothing compares. Hence, the hedging regarding holding the supposed flat falseness of flattish eartherism. Its supposed factual falseness doesn't really entail anything necessarily like its ontological invalidity, and perhaps not even its lacking of truth, let alone truth, truthiness, or even such things as goodness. Which begs the question some as to what people are referring to when they are referring to truth. The disposition that truth refers rather specifically to the molding of the epistemically ontologically valid to the ontologically valid sans any epistemic, e.g. fact, is manifestly incorrect, largely incoherent, and very plausibly unethical in its pragmatics of application. Call such the scientific disposition to hold that all views that do not conform to it are flatly false. The reader may also fruitfully understand such as the empirical viewpoint, and plausibly the supposed view from nowhere, the ivory tower, the mountain top, and objectivity as such. Though to be coy about it all, some of those have far more validity to them than others. The conflation of these is as highly dubious as the rumors of my death. To try and be clear on the matter, in terms of understanding the functional nature of truth, or truthiness, we are not able to, and ethically may not want to, fully distinguish such predicated upon the suppositions of fact. There are other ontologically valid, and hence in some sense factual in how that term is commonly understood and used, aspects that accrue within the imaginative musings, the fictive forms, that partake therefore in the fundamental aspects of truth, and truthiness. what we are generally referring to as truth may already be caught up in the matter of how exactly, as a matter of ethics and pragmatics, does the epistemically ontologically valid interface with the ontologically valid sans any epistemic ontic. Which is to say rather bluntly that the notion of a removal of the epistemically ontologically valid as such in favor of a supposition that the epistemic ought to be synonymous with the ontic sans any epistemic is, again, flatly incoherent. The delicacies of the ethicities involved in that relationship, which I shall without much argumentation to it note is self-similarly formed, likely fractally structured, dynamic, and likely asymmetrical in structure, is itself the field of play within and through which the functional relations of truth, and truthiness all take their forms. I hope such provides the reader with the proper understanding as to why I am hedging on the matter, and why the issues being discussed here have significant import beyond the seeming obviousness and silliness of the question, is the earth flat or not? The delicate structures of the conceptual themselves constituting some significant aspect of the species entails the ethical necessity of gentle hands with a sharp scalpel to address the relevant questions. Again, if the question of flattish eartherism seems too overly obvious, too overly silly, consider how such relates to a wide variety of cultural practices, faith-based belief structures, and really belief structures in general. When a dance is outlawed, just when I thought our chance had passed, you go and save the best for last. Sometimes the very thing you're looking for is the one thing you can't see. There is a kind of response that has some significant validity to it. The terms fact, truth, etc. are being maligned, misused, or at any rate, that they ought to have some kind of a solid definition to them such that when we say factually speaking, the earth is roundish, we are not including within factualness the epistemically ontic validity of the proposition that the earth is flat. In essence what fact has meant is exactly the ontological structure sans any relation to the epistemic as such, despite the inherent incoherencies involved in such an enterprise. Truth, more so truth and truthiness, may deal with the intricacies involved in these delicate creatures of the imaginative musings, with how the epistemic interfaces with the ontic, but fact specifically doesn't do such things. Such a response belies the relevant questions involved in the ethicity of TPKing flattish eartherism predicated upon factual understandings. In other words, factually speaking, we could easily eat this response and shrug our shoulders. So a factual understanding is a kind of understanding that flatly ignores certain aspects about reality in order to present an understanding that avoids those aspects of reality. In which case we can move the question a bit and note that what is being said of the earth being roundish is merely factually relevant information, but doesn't thereby also deal with the relevant epistemic/ontic interface that involves all those other kinds of aspects of reality that factual-based argumentation, discussion, etc. deliberately leaves out. Those kinds of questions delve into the realms of truth, and truthiness, and likewise get better towards the questions involving privilege and its relation to colonialism, and the realities of ethicities. We might go so far as to say that the attitudinal disposition so expressed by this sentiment is exactly the colonialistic disposition, with all its horrors fully intact. That is, the position of factualness being exactly that which excludes from the ontic any epistemic that doesn't conform to the ontic sans any epistemic as being the primary colonialistic modality, especially as it relates to the horrors thereof. The genocidal consequences as a justifiable moral position arises from exactly this sort of understanding. To be clear, TPKing were not flattish eartherism, and by extension any set or subset of other conceptual frameworks, cannot be justified via merely factually based information because factually based information specifically avoids those kinds of perspectives at all. Factually based information in essence is mute on the topic, they've silenced themselves on the point. Though as just noted, in the pragmatics the disposition exactly makes folks self-assured enough to do those kinds of things. Indeed, the factually based disposition holds to itself exactly the modality of cutting away at all other kinds of dispositions as its mode of life. that they lack any moral, ethical justification for doing so, let alone any kind of obvious soundly logical rationale for doing so, is besides the point. After all, it is an unethical sort of thing they are doing. To quote the poets, albeit not untroubled in their meanings, "There'll be no strings to bind your hands. Not if my love can't bind your heart. There's no need to take a stand. For it was I who chose to start." Still, the hypothetical objector here may have a point that we are maligning, misusing, etc., the terms truth, truthiness, truth, fact, etc. I am humorously strongly reminded of the reprimand by his accusers to Socrates that he made the weaker argument the stronger. Let's take each of these notions of truth in turn. Truthiness. What is meant by truthiness is a kind of loose association and pretense towards something like truth or truth. A verisimilitude of truth or truth. In relation to truth, for instance, truthiness may well be understood as a rephrasing of someone's personal truth without having the direct relevant lived experiences upon which their personal truth is predicated. In relation to truth, truthiness denotes something like truth but without specificity. For instance, vagueness that nonetheless points towards the truth, terminologies that evoke the proper understanding but which themselves do not actualize the truth-specific terminology. Truthiness can be fruitfully and fairly easily grasped as playing loose with truth. Despite this, truthiness has its validities and usefulness to it. For instance, metaphor, story times that are intended to convey some message, etc., such arguably at any rate partakes in truthiness as their mainstay for conceptual understanding. Flattish eartherism as it describes the actual experiences that people have most of the time is a good way of grasping at what is meant by truthiness in the context of this piece. In regards to truth, that is, little t truth, the notion mostly, and perhaps completely, revolves around the concept of the individual, personal, lived experiences of people as having of themselves validity. In the context of this piece, such validity is understood as ontological validity. They exist, in other words, in some way or another. Validity ought not necessarily be understood as truth, nor ethical soundness, despite its nomenclature of truth. In the context of this piece, truth can be understood as a particular expression of an epistemic reality. Flattish eartherism as it is understood by a particular person is a manifestation of truth. Someone's wildest dreams they may be, yet they may be nonetheless. Thus he said, "Let's get out of this town. Drive out of the city, away from the crowds. I thought heaven can't help me now. Nothing lasts forever. But this is gonna take me down." Truth, with the big T, is the notion that there are broader categories of reality that have validity to them. Such ought not be understood as being synonymous with the real or the factual, though those things may partake in truth themselves. Such things are likely subsets of truth, but not necessarily synonymous with it. In the context of this piece, truth is holding to the ethically sound modalities of epistemic/ontic interfacing. In regards to flattish eartherism, if there is a truth to it, it is to be understood as the neuron structures that formulate the kind of understanding that is flattish eartherism, the experience that is, of experiencing, processing, and understanding the world as flat, and perhaps the phenomenological reality of the species to formally learn and experience their reality as exactly that of a flattish earth. The differentiation between truth and truth in this context amounts to the difference between someone's personal experiences as truth and the underpinning neurological structures upon which any given person's personal experiences are predicated and are the phenomenological reality of the species previously alluded to. Ostensibly all truth-type experiences that the Earth is flattish utilize the truth of the neurological structures that perceive the Earth as flattish and together comprise something akin to the phenomenological truth of the matter. See also the other bits in this piece on the relation of truth with the good and choice. Truth ought also be well understood as strikingly similar to the notion of Santa Claus, e.g. a broadly held and experienced sort of thing that directs the interfacing between the epistemic and the ontic sans any epistemic. The truth of the spirit of Christmas is a coherent statement, one that can be described, and to some degree has been described earlier in this piece. We could of course expand upon these to include sociological elements, educational elements, etc., as modalities that influence someone to hold the view that the earth is flattish, but for the purposes of this piece doing so would be superfluous to the point. Such amounts to the definitions of the relevant common terms used to delineate between phenomena. It's a bit dualistic but worthwhile in noting how the supposed counterpoints to these terms function, what they are in an ontological sense. With hesitation in heart's content, such may be a bit akin to coming from Eden. Still, with some fair musing and poetic license, is of ethical import more than its mereness in factual states. In relation to factualness, that which is not factual is understood as that which is not epistemically independent in regards to its ontology. Something not being a fact, again, doesn't entail anything even approaching lacking in ontology, and not even lacking in truth, truthiness, or truth. When someone says that they are merely utilizing the facts, they are not, quite frankly, making a particularly profound or powerful sort of argument. Factualness can and oft is utilized as a way of saying pragmatic or that which works, or that which is functional. For instance, a given machine process utilizes a variety of facts about motion in order to effectively do some sort of mechanical action. This, however, is not a particularly good justification against flattish eartherism. After all, it is entirely practical for the species to understand the world as flattish. It is pragmatic and it works and it is functional. Granted, we can hold that understanding the earth as roundish enables the species to do more things and hence it is more pragmatic, at least in some sense of that term. Nonetheless, flattish eartherism remains practical, mechanically effective, even mechanically efficient in a wide variety of situations. I am reminded that in terms of pragmatics, scientists oft utilize Newtonian physics for their calculations, because it is pragmatic to do so, despite the presumed fact that Newtonian physics doesn't actually model space-time correctly. This example gives some good insight into the nature of the claim factualness, specifically that in order for factualness to be a meaningful aspect to hold, the facts are only relevant insofar as they are excluding the epistemic. And hence what is not factual is merely that which either is entirely or partially dependent upon the ontological epistemic. In terms of justifications for TPKing flattish eartherism, and indeed, in terms of the pragmatics of doing so, factual analysis doesn't really offer much of use. Folks for factual analysis as being foundational against fiction frame themselves in degrees of helplessness. The point there being, the emotive and the philosophical are not entirely distinct, and indeed, are strongly related. After all along, I never wanted anything more than I wanted you, such could speak towards you, or perhaps from you to me. And as a matter of pragmatics, such inclusions within the text itself at least provide the gentle readers with the plausibility of meaningfulness in their interpretation. Leaving them helpless is perhaps part of the point. Freedom of choice in the matters of pertinence entails a helplessness of form in the fore. Falseness as a common term is utilized to define and describe something that is contrary to the truth of the matter. As we've already shown, falseness is not the same thing as lacking factualness. Falseness, like truth, and also plausibly like truth and truthiness, is a concept that is itself already caught up in the relationship between the epistemically ontic and the ontic sans any epistemic. Something can be false, in this view, and nonetheless be factually correct. Specifically, the holding, having, and acting upon false opinions is a matter of epistemic/ontological relation. Hence the whole discussion here regarding flattish eartherism. Its factualness is assumed out of hand, in virtue of its existence. Its truth or falsity has to do with its relation between the epistemic and the ontic sans the epistemic. The house of its existence, in other words, mark it out as false, while the formal structure of its existence marks it out as factually correct. This runs somewhat counter to the previous notions given on factualness, and likewise likely runs against at least some folks' intuitions on the matter. However, I think that it clears up some of the confusions involved, or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I leave such determinations to the more gentle of readers. I wonder if folks may hear me, and folks like me, now. To be on the nose for the entirely obtuse, that when the chains are wrapped around my door, where exactly are you left but utterly helpless? When the mere scientism of your positions enthrall you, to where do you turn for elucidation? There is a point of logic that really ought in all you want, be understood from the historical and philosophical split about 100 years ago from this writing, between the sciences and philosophy. If you love me, why'd you leave me? When, to be boring, trite, technical and historical about it all, Einstein and Bergson gave their disagreement with each other on the matters of temporality, our love was made for movie screens, y'all. When the chains are locked and tied around my door, the exclusion of the medium, of the variable, the philosophical, the truth-functional relation itself denotes its importance. Think, little ones. Was the experiment too much? Look again ye upon the 20th century, to hear you knocking on my door. When me and those like me depart such that you are alone and not by my side. As remedy, I mean, how more explicit can I be than the inclusion of the musical score to the philosophical discourse? That it comes from a musical source that is derivative of me, I mean, what more would one expect? The point being that as I utilize the tools available to me, the musical and hence emotively evocative pieces from my playlists derived within exactly that context, with great effort and trial, I mean, at least I'm trying winky face. But then I am I not? Am I now? Helplessness, all I want, and remedy? I mean, come on y'all. My little ones, in this context, with my integrity on the matters of pertinence? Hope, how utterly uncontrived ye be. Take it. Did I not bring out the best in thee? Is loneliness not your disease? Let's suppose that factualness is limited in scope in its entirety as previously noted, e.g. that what is factual is strictly ontology, independent of any epistemic concerns whatsoever. In which case falseness and truth each may partake in factualness, but factualness doesn't partake in either, as both truth and falseness are inherently caught up with the epistemically ontologically valid. What is being suggested is a kind of dynamic relationship rather than a static state of being. Factualness is applicable to claims of truth and falseness, perhaps even as a matter of course, but truth and falseness are not applicable to claims of facts. The notion being that applicableness denotes a doing, and partaking denotes a having done to. It is a fact that unicorns exist. This isn't really disputable. The claims regarding the house of its existence, the manner and ways of its existence, likewise are factual sorts of claims. Unicorns exist as ideas, concepts, in books, lore, mythology, etc. These are all factual sorts of claims. The truth or falsity of a claim is already dependent upon there being some set of facts to the matter at hand. The truth of the matter regarding unicorns may be far more caught up in the ethicity of the concern, the plausibility of choices involved in the question. That is, there are a multitude of plausible interpretations as to the hows and whys of unicorns. The whys and hows of views of unicorns, of beliefs about unicorns, of modalities of living predicated or not upon unicorns. Each of which have some series of facts about them, in terms of what sorts of effective and effective forms may arise from the various whys and hows. So, to believe that there are flesh and blood unicorns roaming the woods protecting them with their magical powers may entail that people holding such beliefs go out in the woods searching for them, leaving offerings to unicorns, praying to them, etc. These are factual sorts of things that arise from the particular belief regarding unicorns. Those who believe that unicorns exist as epistemically valid entities, whose ontology is confined to the imaginative musings, the words and pictures of books, etc., are likely to play with unicorns merely in their imaginative musings, perhaps in pictures, perhaps by writing about them. Those comprise a different set of facts that arise from the ontology of unicorns. To play with the poets on this one, it's a little bit of everything in an orange sky. We can hold that there is factual wrongness about the former view, specifically that there are no flesh and blood unicorns, but that doesn't make the belief thereof, the modality of living, etc., false. Nor, for that matter, does it make it true. Its factualness merely is or isn't. What makes such a thing true or false has to do with the fact of the plausibility of choices involved predicated upon those facts. There are a few ways to interpret that point. It could be that it is simply a matter of choice as to what is true and what is false. That is, truth is relative. However, I think this point refers far more to the little t truth, which isn't exactly what we are speaking of when we are speaking of big T truth. The truth of it is a lived experience sort of thing, and amounts to at best and worst a matter of data. Its truth, in other words, may very well inform the truth of the matter, but it isn't itself the truth of the matter. Here readers may do well to understand that in terms of lived experiences, a person's lived experience as a matter of relevant data is important, comprising the phenomenological reality of their lives, but as a matter of truth it is merely informative of the questions, informative too of the larger scalar prospects within which the lived experience is occurring. Such is expediently understandable as the difference between the organism living in an ecology and the ecology within which the organism is living. Likewise, such is long ago generalized as the whole/part relations. If one wants to get relevant data about the queers, for instance, listen to the queers. If one wants to make determinations of truth about how the queers interact with the world, such isn't strictly derivable from nor delimited to the dispositions of the queers. After all, to interact with the world in general entails interaction with the non-queers, and hence the views of the non-queers become relevant, and whereby the issues of truth, ethicity of interactions, cultural differences, colonialism, etc., all become relevant. So little t truth holds that truth is relative, that what is false for truth are simply the other views that are not held by the holder of truth. We might well surmise that concerns regarding the little g good, that is, regarding the ethicity of the matter likewise come to amount to the same sort of issue. The good for the individual, in other words, is nominally, though not completely, determinable by the individual. Of course, again, insofar as the individual is interacting in a community context with diversity of peoples, the individualist sorts of concerns become far less relevant to the issues of truth, beyond, again, the raw data of truth and the good that such relativized terms can provide. Which, to be clear, isn't nothing or of no ethical import. As if a poet spoke to me thusly, had me in the palm of your hand. But you still throw me down to see how I land. Perhaps missy me. We could also reasonably hold that truth and falsity are dependent upon choice, indeed upon the freedom of the will to make those kinds of choices at all, but they are nonetheless not reducible to the mereness of the lived experiences thereof. That is, for instance, we may very well hold that there are goods and bads associated with this or that belief structure regarding unicorns, and that the truth of the matter is far more related to the underpinning ethicity of the circumstances. What makes it true, in other words, is an ought of concern regarding the facts of the matter. It may be a factually correct thing that, for instance, some culture or distant people sacrificed in some terrible way to the unicorns. What makes it false, however, and indeed what makes it such that it couldn't ever be true, is that the sacrifice was terrible, e.g. that it was bad, evil, unethical, etc. We may of course wonder at what exactly made it bad, evil, unethical, etc. Was it because it was false? But that isn't exactly the point at any rate. The point ATM is to garner a kind of understanding as to how truth, falsity, and factualness relate to each other. Like a human managing to stand up for the first time, the capacity of people to make a choice in the matter may entail having an understanding of the facts of the matter, but the choices involved are not actually reducible to the mereness of the facts of the matter. Moreover, that such choice and capacity to do so thereof is not necessarily a reduction from the facts, that is, their lack of factualness isn't inherently a detriment, they may very well be the good simpliciter. The choice of the ethicity being exactly the defining characteristic of the good. Simply put, facts are aethical, amoral, lack choice, they lack good or evil, good or bad, etc., they lack ethicity. Choice, the freedom of choice thereof, the epistemically ontologically valid is plausibly an additive to the ontology, plausibly for better or worse. But then those the kinds of questions of concern in this piece on the privileging of positions, the horrors and potential goods associated with colonialism. Here we are suggesting that what makes something true or false is a matter of its ethicity and choice in the matter, which isn't something that is reducible to the mereness of factualness. To further hammer the point in, it may be the case that the unicorn culture as a matter of course does some good in the world via their various cultural practices associated with the unicorn. In virtue of their belief structure, we would then hold that it is true in virtue of the good that it does, regardless of if the belief structure entailed some factually incorrect thing, e.g. that there are actually flesh and blood unicorns running around in the forests. The case of Santa Claus is perhaps more intuitive for people, but I leave it to the gentle readers here to expound upon that particular case. Though I will note that there are a variety of plausibly good and bad kinds of things associated with the case of Santa Claus, and that hence there are both true and false aspects thereof. Perhaps a more interesting and similarly intuitive example of this sort of thing are the actions of animals that have effective form beyond whatever their intentions may be. That is, a squirrel may eat nuts for food, but in the process it is also seeding the trees. What it does is a good, we suppose, or at any rate is arguably a good, but it isn't as if it is doing so for the factual reasons associated with the seeding. It does so for some other set of reasons, each of which are true, if as the squirrel may very well hold as false that it is seeding the trees. In this case, we are merely speaking of a difference of intentionality between the case of unicorn culture and Santa Claus. Perhaps, after all, the species knows that Santa isn't real, yet still the practices of recognizing such an ephemeral creature as that entails a lot of goods associated with it, and hence a lot of truth beyond the mereness of the factual claims involved in the matter. Likewise for the unicorn culture, who perhaps act to protect the forests, and may have any number of other kinds of goods, known and unknown, to their practices. Any number of which, if asked, they would say is false as to the why that they are performing the actions they do. In terms of this piece, the questions here entail a kind of choice of preference, that is, a privileging of the good, and hence too, a privileging of the truth as a matter of choice. There may very well not be anything further to the point, but that ought not be taken to mean that the point isn't important. As noted, this does leave open the questions regarding what is and is not ethical, what is and what is not good, but it does provide at least some hints at solutions to those sorts of problems. For one, factual analysis is given its proper role, not as arbiter of truth, but rather as a fairly neutral, somewhat boring and uninspiring descriptor of the reality. We cannot make the determination as to if something is good or evil, good or bad, etc., without having at our disposal a factual analysis of the situation. One that doesn't purport itself to make heads or tails of the situation in terms of good, bad, or indifferent. To be uber clear on the point though, factual analysis simply is not a stand-in for the good, for truth, and its absence doesn't entail an evil, a bad, or a falseness. Its absence signals merely an asymmetry in the relation between the epistemically ontologically valid and the ontologically valid sans any epistemic at all. Factually speaking, flesh and blood Santa Claus is an incorrect claim, or incorrectness actually entails an asymmetrical claim between the ontological epistemic and the ontic sans any epistemic, but the reality of Santa Claus is indubitable. There are a few other important considerations on this matter. Lies v. truth. Gentle readers ought begin to notice how in the common parlance truth does a lot of work. Truth is contra lies, falseness, and contrafactuals. In part 1 I'm hoping to clear up how this term is being utilized. As it relates to lies, truth as a concept is fairly easy to grasp within the framework we've built thus far here, and aligns well with most everyone's intuitions on the matter. A lie is a discontinuity between a person's epistemic disposition and what they present as being the case of their epistemic disposition. A lie exists, it has ontological import to it. A lie isn't merely a factually incorrect statement. A lie is a way by which a person pretends. Again, Santa Claus or a unicorn culture both present lies, though in either case arguably not particularly harmful sorts of lies, or at any rate, not obviously harmful. They are lies not merely because there are no flesh and blood counterparts beyond the epistemic state, but rather, they are lies because and insofar as people know there is no flesh and blood counterpart and yet present such as if there really were. Compared to the reality of a song and dance, in these they are merely aesthetic dispositions whose ontology is caught up in the relation between the epistemic and the ontic sans the epistemic, but they are not lies, as there isn't any intentionality to them that purports to say something other than its epistemic ontological disposition. Importantly, this helps to distinguish between the plausibly good aesthetical dispositions of, say, beauty, from those of the plausibly bad aesthetical dispositions that may accrue from something like a lie. Note in the case of Santa Claus and unicorn culture, there may be no harm, and indeed plausible ethical good involved with the lies, which does oft present something of a common bit of cognitive dissonance within folks. Some of this can be explained away via the other aspects discussed in this section. Specifically, just because it is a lie, doesn't necessarily entail that it doesn't exist, nor that it necessarily lacks factualness to it, nor again does it necessarily entail an ethical bad. Much as truth does a lot of work, has a lot of roles in the common discourse, so too does lie. Rather, a lie is related to intent, whereby the liar is deliberately misleading for some reason or another. We could hold that there is definitionally a bad or unethicalness to a lie, though by doing so we are committing ourselves to propositions that I am fairly positive most folks wouldn't want to. Truth-telling isn't always the most pragmatically good course. One doesn't, for instance, simply tell the truth to the little ones on a wide variety of things, rather one tends to lie to them in this or that way, as a matter of the pragmatics of raising the little ones. I could go on and give a lot of further examples, but the point is that while we may choose to definitionally lump lies together with ethical bads, we are not likely to be able to do so in a consistent manner, specifically, a manner by which the ethics of the good maintain in the pragmatics of application. If given the choice between definitionally lumping lies together with the bad, and thereby miscategorizing a lot of good as the bad, and acknowledging that lies are not all bad, and thereby properly categorizing the good as the good, I'd suggest that folks interested in the good do the latter. Nonetheless, lies are about the intentions of a person. One may lie and do so towards the good, with good intentions that is, but it is a lie nonetheless. The only reason that there is even the hint of debate about this point is precisely that folks have generally lumped lies and ethical bads together. I strongly suspect because of the multitude of meanings assigned to truth as a concept. In other words, folks are confusing one concept of truth, that of its ethical import of the good, with another use of truth, that as a counterpoint to the misrepresentation of one's own epistemic state, e.g. counter to lies. Perhaps it is helpful for folks to hear a paradox of the truth-teller. I can truthfully say that I lie. I can truthfully tell a lie. The paradox here is largely depending upon the multiple meanings associated with the term truth, rather than anything particularly deep. I typically refer to this as being an honest liar, to dispel the seemingness of the paradox. I am honest about the factual state that I lie. I don't constantly lie, I am not always lying, but there are things about which I can, have, and will lie about. Moreover, I do so most of the time at any rate because to do so is to aim towards the good. It is to meet someone where they are at in their life, in their understanding, to present myself to them as if I were on a level with them, and then guide them in a manner that, as far as I can tell at any rate, is towards the good. Or, it can be far less deep than that, and can speak towards fictive things as if they were real in the sense of flesh and blood entities, etc. Again, there are lots of reasons to lie that are good, or at least aim towards the good. It may be fruitful to understand this more as a playing with the aesthetic aspects in an ethical manner, whereby lie isn't exactly the proper term to utilize. In other words, much as truth is used in a variety of contexts leading to folks confusing its various meanings, so too does the aesthetic thereby get used. Here we are pointing towards the notion of the aesthetic as something that isn't particularly present in the ontic sans the epistemic. Whereby if I said to you that there is Santa Claus, you might hold I am lying to you specifically because there isn't a flesh and blood Santa Claus. But I am not lying, rather I am presenting in an honest manner a certain aesthetic, that is, a certain epistemic/ontic relation, which can be described, etc., which when understood as a whole, amounts to a kind of spirit of Christmas and a kind of aesthetic of living in the world. The potential virtue in understanding this may provide is that it may allow folks whose intuition is that lie is bad may grasp at the point without giving up on that notion. It isn't that it is a white lie, or that there are exceptions to the principle that lies are bad, it is that what is being spoken of is an aesthetic rather than a factual sort of claim. Its truth and falsity being a determinant of its ethicity and freedom of choice, rather than the supposition of reality or lack thereof. This point suggests one more aspect regarding how I am utilizing the concepts of truth and falseness, one that is not particularly common within the discourse, but which is of a sort of paramount importance. To what time frame are we assigning the value of truth, truthiness? And so too, falseness? How contextualized is truth? When we speak of eternal truths, we are speaking of the sorts of truths that remain so regardless of any circumstances save at least this one, eternalness. In other words, an eternal truth is such within the context of the eternal, which is a particular time frame of understanding. Are we speaking of truths that are relevant towards what ends? Towards what aims? Is it the case, after all, that something can be true at some point, and false or more blandly not true at some other point? We can pretend, that is, lie, by holding that something that is true is always eternally true in virtue of it being true, by holding that we might time index the truth of the matter. Which is to say, that we can hold that this thing that existed in such and thus an enumerated manner of existence may change, may come to exist in some other manner, all the qualities, quantifiable bits and pieces, aspects of it, and so forth may change over time, but nonetheless at the time index point in which those qualities were enumerated they were and always shall be true. Hence, the truth of the matter is an eternal sort of thing. However, to do so, we are pretending that there is this other thing called time that exists independent of the thing that is being described. That is, that there is a distinctive measurement of time that is not of the thing being so described, and then we are referencing that specific independent time frame to hold the position that therefore the true statements are eternally so, rather than being contingently so predicated upon the particular circumstances thereof. For those readers not in the know on this point, it is as if the contents of the true statements were not themselves of the world, that is, of the temporality of the world they are purporting to describe. Within the context of this piece, and how we are understanding and describing the truth/falsity relations and relatas, we may understand such as being fundamentally conflating the epistemic understanding with that of the ontology sans any epistemic whatsoever. A holding of the pure concept of something as if it were independent of the ontology, and then overlaying that conceptualization upon the ontology sans any epistemic concerns whatsoever. It is, to be blunt, a false disposition masquerading as the truth. It falters on its factuality, and it may even tacitly always be aware of this. That is, the holder of the proposition may always tacitly be aware of this, and yet nonetheless state it. Regardless, the falseness of the disposition arises from its choice, and its ethicity, that it may also be factually incorrect, is also of interest. Are there atemporal entities of the sort, I mean, factually speaking in the strict sense we've outlined here? No. In terms, however, of the truthiness sort of understanding, in reference to the epistemic ontic, there is reality there simply in virtue of the statement of a temporality. Does the atemporal have meaningful truthful import to the temporality? Almost definitionally not. For the purposes of this piece, we are holding that the truth-functional relation has of it some kind of temporality that is not atemporal in its form. That is, the absence of temporality, atemporality, is not a part of the truth-functional relation. There are arguably some versions of eternal truth structures that are nonetheless temporal in form, such as versions of fractal temporality, repetitious temporality, Einsteinian temporality, truth as obtaining in all possible worlds, etc. However, these notions go well beyond the scope of this piece. The point here is to provide the reader with a sense of what is being spoken of in terms of truth as such relates to temporality. To put it in less abstracted terms, we are speaking of something like the question, when you speak of truth, what time frame are you concerned with? Short-term truth? Longer-term truth? To what aspect of concern are the things you, the reader, concerned with? Are you concerned with something in the immediate? The pleasures, pains, ethicity of an action that accrue from a particular given action? Whereas, perhaps, in the repetitive performance of that action the ethicity of the actions change? If, for instance, we speak of gathering together some kind of pretty jewel from the earth for oneself, such as an action in the immediate may be a good, may be a fine sort of thing, its ethicity and hence its truth-functional relation may be good. If everyone does so, perhaps the ethicity of the actions change to the evil. Perhaps then, after all, the earth is harmed, the value of the jewels lessened, the amount of labor involved too great, the rewards diminished to such a small fraction thereof as to be meaningless. Perhaps, though, and this is a bit hopefully speaking, perhaps as the value diminishes, folks such as you gentle readers may come to realize that indeed even in the first instance, even in the immediate of the action to which we ascribed a supposed good, there was none at all. Such, after all, is at least one way to grasp at the efficacy of the noble lies we, folks such as myself, sometimes tell. The lies that aim, that is, towards the good, regardless of if the short-term harms may be present. The upshot here, for this piece at any rate, as they relate to the practices of colonialism, are such things as forcing folks from otherwise disparate communities to interact, despite all their racist tendencies to do otherwise the good thing to do? Despite the horrors they inflict upon each other, despite the relatively short-term harms that accrue from the actions, for in the longer term, the good is thereby forged. The ethical questions therein are, admittedly, somewhat difficult for people to grasp at, and perhaps such amounts to a variety of biological errors the species is dealing with, perhaps such errors are perennial, perhaps they are not. But the thrust of it, the real concern, is how does the species manage that factual reality, and to what time frame are we really concerned with? On this point, there is perhaps much that could and has been said, but it is not something that appears much within the common discourses. Someone may, in other words, be speaking of relief now to address something that is occurring in the now, in the immediate, and when they say the truth of the matter or the facts of the matter they are referring rather specifically to the immediate time frame, perhaps even to the derision of any sense of longer-term concerns. Another person may be referring to the same issue, with similar aims even, and yet making claims towards longer-term concerns, and hence derive different sorts of conclusions as to what the truth of the matter really is. Troubling thing is, of course, each of these are correct, each is a variant of truth, each may have value in practice, and yet it is thereof that much of the vitriolic discourse on the topics comes about. To bring it to the point of flattish earthers, someone concerned with the immediate may hold that the only thing to be concerned about are, say, the feelings of the people involved, the facts of the matter, who is right and who is wrong in a factual sense, etc. Someone concerned with longer-term issues may look at the situation and derive different kinds of concerns, many of which are being expressed in this piece, and hence have quite a different view of what the truth of the matter may be, and moreover, what the ethicity of a given action may be. To again be blunt about the whole thing, to what extent is the cruelty involved in an attempted TPK of flattish earthers the sort of thing that is characteristic of all cultural genocidal tendencies? And to what extent may those actually be the sorts of things the species wants, that is, that are good for it? To what extent might they actually be bad, awful? How to distinguish between these kinds of aspects? Can they be distinguished well? In terms of truth, as has been expressed throughout this piece, the mereness of its factual failings isn't a sufficient indicator to its truth or the ethicity of the concern. Flattish eartherism is factually wrong, at least in the most conventional and acceptable of senses, yet it is a truth, and has truthiness to it. The truth of the matter as to its eradication, to TPK or not to TPK, amounts far more to the ethicities involved, and may entail a proper understanding of what time frame are we even speaking of in terms of the good.
What you say?